It is not one case, it is not two, it is case after case after case, institution after institution, country after country, and together they tell a story that almost no one in the Catholic press has the courage to state plainly, with the numbers laid out side by side. By the end of this video, you will have before you two trajectories running in opposite directions simultaneously in the same church, in the same era, in the same secularized world. And the numbers, when placed honestly next to each other, without editorial softening, speak with a force that no speech from any dicastery or any synodal assembly has managed to produce. Begin with the news that arrived in the first weeks of July 2026. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, the largest and most influential religious order in the Catholic Church, the order that for centuries produced the missionaries and theologians and spiritual directors who shaped Catholic civilization across every continent, announced that it will reduce its novitiates in North America from 5 to 2 by 2028. The reason given in the official letter of July 9th was stated without elaboration. There are no longer enough vocations. Managing 5 novitiates requires a great deal of quality personnel, a superior explained. Simply put, there are no longer enough young people entering. Anyone who knows the recent history of the Jesuits will hear something in that announcement that goes beyond administrative logistics. The Society of Jesus was in the post-conciliar period the order that led every opening, every reform, every adaptation to the contemporary world. It was the vanguard of engagement with modern culture, of liturgical experimentation, of theological development that sought to bring the Church into dialogue with the present moment. It was the order whose influence shaped the documents that shaped the era. And the era is now presenting it with an accounting that 5 novitiates reduced to 2 by 2028 makes legible to anyone willing to read it. But perhaps this is an isolated case. Perhaps the Jesuit situation reflects factors specific to that order, its history, its particular trajectory, its relationship with its own founding charism. Perhaps elsewhere the picture is different. Move to France. An analysis by Laurent Dastro, recently published and widely circulated among those who track the state of the French Church, reveals something that the word shocking does not adequately describe. 3 French dioceses, Aire d'Aix, Luçon-La Roche-sur-Yon, and Arras, have not ordained a single diocesan priest for 12 to 14 consecutive years. Not one. Carcassonne closed a 19-year gap only in 2025, ordaining a single candidate who was 51 years old. Not a young man beginning his priestly life with decades of ministry ahead. A middle-aged man, the only candidate in nearly 2 decades, ordained at an age when many priests are already thinking about the shape of their final years of ministry. Dastro's warning about where this trajectory leads is not alarmist speculation. It is arithmetic. If current trends continue, some of those dioceses could find themselves with as few as 3 native priests each. 3 priests for an entire diocese. 3 men to serve the sacramental needs of every Catholic within those geographic boundaries, to celebrate Mass, to hear confessions, to administer last rites, to baptize, to witness marriages, to bury the dead. The institution that exists to bring Christ to souls would have 3 men to do it, across territories that contain hundreds of thousands of people. And it is not only priests. The female religious orders that in the 1970s abandoned their habits, left their cloisters, dissolved the structures that had defined their identity and their witness, now have elderly sisters and empty novitiate wings. Entire convents are dying out, one nun at a time, with no one coming to fill the places being left vacant. The orders that were most enthusiastic about renewal, most willing to set aside what seemed like historical accretion to engage the world on the world's terms, are the ones whose futures are now measured in years rather than centuries. Someone will say that this is secularization, that the crisis of vocations and the emptying of churches is a cultural phenomenon, a product of the post-Christian trajectory of Western Europe and North America, a consequence of forces that no religious order and no diocese could have resisted regardless of what choices it made. And that explanation is not entirely wrong. The crisis has many causes, and it would be dishonest to reduce it to a single factor. Broken families, a culture that no longer transmits faith from one generation to the next. The exhaustion of a West that has been running on Christian capital for 2 centuries without replenishing it. The specific wounds of the abuse crisis that have driven people away from institutional Catholicism in numbers that no recovery effort has fully addressed. All of these are real causes, and a serious account of the situation cannot ignore them. But then something else requires explanation, something that the secularization thesis, taken alone, cannot account for. Because in the same secularized world, in the same countries, in the same years, in the same cultural climate that is producing the Jesuit announcement and the empty French dioceses, there are Catholic communities that are not closing their novitiates. There are communities that are not going 12 or 14 years between ordinations. There are communities where the waiting list for the novitiate is longer than the available space, and where the problem is not finding candidates, but housing them. The secularization explanation predicts a uniform decline. What the data shows is not a uniform decline, it shows a divergence. 2 trajectories running simultaneously in the same environment. And when 2 things are exposed to the same environmental conditions and produce opposite results, the explanation for the divergence cannot be found in the environment. It has to be found in the difference between the things themselves. In France, 12 Benedictine monks from the Abbey of Labourou recently refounded an ancient abbey, Notre Dame de Bellefontaine, bringing monastic life back to a place where the Trappists had been. Their liturgy is celebrated in Latin and Gregorian chant. The new prior said it without apology and without the hedging that institutional Catholic communications have made standard. Our liturgy will be celebrated in Latin and Gregorian chant. There will be those who love it and those who do not. Everyone must discern for themselves. No chasing after the fashion of the moment. No strategic adaptation to contemporary preferences. A clear statement of identity and an invitation to those who find that identity meaningful. And the young people are coming. In the United States, a church in St. Louis dedicated to St. Francis de Sales was scheduled for demolition after its parish closed in 2005. Archbishop Raymond Burke entrusted it to an institute associated with the traditional Mass. Today that church, which was supposed to disappear into rubble, welcomes more than 700 faithful every Sunday. The reports consistently note the same detail. Most of them are young adults and families. Precisely the demographic that is missing from the parishes where the renovation of the church after the council was most thoroughly implemented. Precisely the people who, according to the theory that drove the post-conciliar changes, were supposed to be attracted by a church that spoke their language, engaged their culture, and shed the forms that seemed to belong to another age. They are not there. They are at St. Francis de Sales. 700 of them every Sunday in a church that was supposed to be demolished. And these are not isolated exceptions that can be dismissed as anomalies or explained away as the attraction of a small and self-selecting subculture of Catholic eccentrics who prefer incense and Latin to anything resembling the modern world. The pattern is systematic. Seminaries associated with the traditional Mass in Europe and America struggle to find space for all the candidates presenting themselves, while a few kilometers away, immense diocesan seminaries sit half-empty, their corridors and dining halls and chapel pews accommodating a fraction of the students they were built to serve. The Fraternity of St. Peter is not struggling for seminarians. The Institute of Christ the King is not closing novitiates. The communities of women religious that maintained their habits and their cloistered identity through the decades when abandoning both seemed like the only path to relevance are the communities where young women are still presenting themselves and asking to enter. The communities that followed the logic of adaptation, that shed the habit because it seemed like a barrier to engagement, that dissolved the cloister because it seemed like an obstacle to mission, are the communities whose average age is now in the 70s and whose future can be measured by counting the surviving members. The data is not ambiguous. The divergence is real, and it is growing more visible with each passing year as the consequences of decisions made 50 and 60 years ago mature into their full demographic expression. The Jesuit announcement of July 2026 is not a surprise to anyone who has been reading the numbers honestly. It is the latest and most institutionally significant data point in a trend that has been running in the same direction for decades, and the question that trend demands, the question that the divergence makes impossible to avoid, is the one that the institutions most implicated by the answer have the most institutional incentive not to ask. If adaptation to the world was the strategy that would secure the future, why are the most adapted institutions the ones closing their novitiates? And if fidelity to what was handed down was the path to irrelevance, why are the most traditional communities the ones with waiting lists? The numbers are asking that question, loudly, consistently, in country after country and year after year. And so far, the institutions most implicated by the answer have responded mostly with silence. The pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres happens every year. Tens of thousands of young people walk approximately 100 kilometers over 3 days behind the ancient Mass. Every year the numbers grow. Every year the demographic profile of those walking is the same: young. Families with children, people in their 20s and 30s who were not alive before the Council, who have no personal memory of the pre-conciliar Church, who did not discover the traditional Mass through nostalgia for something they once had. They discovered it through encounter, through stumbling into a chapel or a pilgrimage or a community and finding there something they had not found anywhere else and had not known they were looking for until they found it. Benedict XVI's secretary recently recalled this reality with a precision that deserves to be quoted in its own terms. Where tradition is preserved, numbers grow, especially among young people. Not the nostalgia of elderly people who remember how things used to be, the enthusiasm of young people who have never known anything else and who are choosing this, freely, over everything else available to them in the same cultural marketplace. That fact sits at the center of the divergence this video has been tracing, and it is the fact most resistant to the explanations that institutional Catholic culture has reached for when confronted with the data. The standard explanation for traditional community growth has been that it represents a refuge for the anxious, a defensive reaction by people who cannot cope with change, an attraction to certainty and structure in an uncertain age that will diminish as the culture stabilizes and as the people involved mature in their faith. That explanation has been available for 50 years. The data over those 50 years has not supported it. The communities keep growing, the young people keep arriving, the seminaries keep filling, and the communities that were supposed to represent the future of a renewed church keep emptying. Something is happening that the standard explanation does not account for. And honesty requires attempting to say what it is, rather than reaching again for an explanation that has been falsified by 50 years of evidence. A young person does not leave everything for a church that tells him the world might be right. That sentence from the reference script is the most precise description available of what the data is actually showing. A young man or woman considering a religious vocation, a young family deciding where to attend Mass, a young person in their 20s trying to make sense of what the Catholic faith is and what it asks, is not looking for an institution that has adapted itself to their cultural preferences. They are surrounded by institutions that have adapted themselves to cultural preferences: the university, the media, the therapeutic culture, the entertainment industry, the social structures of late modernity. All of these are already adapted. All of these already speak the language of accompaniment and encounter and dialogue and inclusion. A church that adopts the same vocabulary and the same posture offers nothing that the surrounding culture does not already provide, more fluently and more attractively. What the surrounding culture cannot provide is the absolute, the eternal, the sacred held with enough seriousness to cost something. A young person who is genuinely seeking God, who has looked at the options available in the cultural marketplace of 2026 and found them insufficient, who has arrived at the threshold of the church because they believe, or want to believe, that here is something the world cannot give, encounters in the traditional Mass precisely what they came for. A liturgy that does not tell them God is a concept to be explored in dialogue. A liturgy that places them before a mystery they did not construct and cannot manage, a silence that is not emptiness but weight, a doctrine that does not adjust itself to make them comfortable but calls them to something that their comfort cannot satisfy. That is what fills the pilgrimage to Chartres. That is what fills the pews at St. Francis de Sales in St. Louis. That is what fills the novitiates of the Fraternity of St. Peter, while 5 Jesuit novitiates in North America are reduced to 2. Not nostalgia, not anxiety, not a defensive reaction to modernity. A hunger for the absolute that modernity has left unfed, and that the communities most committed to engaging modernity on its own terms have, in the process of that engagement, also left unfed. The monks of Notre-Dame de Bellefontaine in France understood this when the new prior said plainly that their liturgy would be in Latin and Gregorian chant, and that those who love it will come, and those who do not must discern for themselves. That statement would have been regarded in many Catholic institutional contexts as pastoral recklessness. You cannot say that in 2026, you cannot present yourself without qualification, without adaptation, without the careful hedging that signals openness to all. You will alienate people. You will limit your reach. You will consign yourselves to a small and self-selecting community of the already converted. The monks said it anyway. And the young people came. This is the pattern that the data has been tracing for 50 years and that the Jesuit announcement of July 2026 has made newly visible at the highest institutional level. The communities that presented themselves without qualification, that said, "This is what we are and this is what we do, and those who find it meaningful are welcome," are the communities that found the people they were not chasing. The communities that adapted their presentation to reach the widest possible audience, that softened the edges and translated the vocabulary and updated the forms, found that the audience they were chasing found the adaptation insufficient and looked elsewhere. Not to traditional Catholicism necessarily, often simply away. Now an important qualification must be made, because honesty requires it and because the tradition itself demands it. The ancient Mass alone does not make saints. This is not a video for celebration or for dividing the Church into factions. The people who love tradition do not and should not celebrate the empty churches of others. Those empty churches represent souls, people who came and did not stay, or who never came at all, who are somewhere in the surrounding culture without the sacraments and without the faith, and whose eternal destiny is not served by the institutional decline of the communities that should have reached them. The vocation crisis has roots that no liturgy alone can address. Broken families, a culture that no longer transmits faith from parents to children. The specific damage done by the abuse crisis to the credibility of the institution. A Western civilization that has been living on Christian capital for generations without replenishing it and is now experiencing the consequences of that depletion. All of these are real. A serious account of the divergence between traditional and progressive Catholic communities cannot pretend that the only variable is the Mass. Grace blows where it wills. There are small, faithful, fervent parishes celebrating the ordinary form where genuine conversion happens and where genuine community forms around a genuine encounter with Christ. The divergence the data shows is a tendency, not an absolute rule. And tendencies do not eliminate exceptions. But precisely because the causes of the crisis are so many and so deep, the fact of the divergence becomes more rather than less significant. If all communities were declining at the same rate, the secularization explanation would be sufficient. The culture is post-Christian, the faith is no longer transmitted, the numbers fall everywhere. Adjust expectations accordingly. But that is not what the data shows. The data shows communities in the same culture, the same country, the same era, producing opposite trajectories, some filling, some emptying. And the variable that most consistently correlates with the direction of the trajectory is the one that the institutions most implicated by the correlation have the most reason to resist acknowledging. The history of the Church has seen this pattern before, and it is worth recalling it because the current moment is not the first time that institutional decline and faithful remnant have coexisted in the same era. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century and everything that had seemed permanent and powerful dissolved into the migrations and the wars that followed, it was not the institutions that had accommodated themselves most thoroughly to imperial culture that carried Christian civilization through the darkness. It was the monasteries, small communities of men and women who had said, "This is what we are, and this is what we do," and who in the silence of their cloisters prayed and worked and copied the word and kept alive the flame that would eventually rekindle civilization. The Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work, did not adapt itself to the preferences of the collapsing empire. It held its form through the collapse and emerged on the other side as the seed of everything that followed, the grain of wheat that falls into the ground and dies. The image is not decorative, it is the structural principle of how the gospel works in history. The communities that chased relevance by shedding what seemed like historical accretion, by adapting the form to meet the culture where it was, found that what they had shed was not accretion, it was seed. And what remained after the shedding did not grow. It declined. While the communities that seemed most buried, most marginal, most committed to forms that the age found anachronistic, found that the burial was not death, it was germination. The Jesuit announcement of July 2026 is a data point in that larger story. So are the 3 French dioceses with no ordinations in 14 years. So is the elderly convent with empty novitiate wings. And so is the pilgrimage to Chartres, with its tens of thousands of young people walking 100 kilometers behind a mass that was supposed to be buried. So is the church in St. Louis that was supposed to be demolished and is now too small for 700 faithful on a Sunday morning. The numbers are not making a theological argument. Numbers do not make arguments. They describe realities. And the reality they describe in this case is one that the Catholic conversation of 2026 must eventually find the courage to address without the protective covering of the secularization explanation that has served for 50 years to deflect the question the divergence actually poses. What keeps the Church alive? The answer written in the data is not new. It is as old as the Gospel and as old as the first monks who kept praying in their cloisters while the world collapsed around them. The Church is saved not by resembling the world, but by remaining herself. The future, against every prediction made by the institutions that chose adaptation, has the ancient face of tradition. And the young people walking to Chartres in the rain, the monks chanting in Latin in a refounded abbey in France, the families filling a church in St. Louis that was scheduled for demolition, are telling the Catholic world something that no synodal document and no dicastery note has the authority to contradict. They are here, they came, they are young, and they are not leaving. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.